They all saw her, but no one stopped. The wind howled like a living thing, dragging needles of ice across the open trade platform, rattling steel railings and whispering through cracked thermal panels as if the storm itself had something to say. But no one listened, not the merchants securing their cargo, not the travelers pulling their coats tighter, not the security drones gliding overhead with silent indifference. Because on a world where temperatures dropped to -60 degrees Fahrenheit without warning, survival had long ago replaced sympathy, and anything left in the snow was already considered gone. Ethan Cole adjusted the collar of his worn thermal jacket as he stepped out from the dimly lit corridor, boots crunching over a thin layer of frost that had crept inside the station, his breath fogging in short, controlled bursts as his eyes scanned the path ahead, not out of fear, but habit, the kind built from years of working alone in places where help didn't come unless you built it yourself, and he would have kept walking like everyone else if it weren't for the shape half buried near the edge of the platform, just past the flickering hazard light, where the wind hit hardest, a shape too still, too quiet, too human to ignore. Even if it wasn't human at all, someone brushed past him, muttering something about the storm getting worse. Another voice complained about delayed departures. Boots passed within inches of the figure without slowing, without turning, without even a glance, and Ethan felt it then. Not guilt, not exactly, but resistance, like his body refused the simple command to move forward, like something in him had locked in place while the rest of the world kept going. He exhaled slowly, jaw tightening, and turned his head back toward the shape, just for a second, just to confirm what he already knew he shouldn't care about. But the moment stretched longer than it should have, and then he saw it. The faintest movement, a tremor in the snow, a hand, slender, blue, barely visible against the frost, fingers curled inward like they had tried to hold on to warmth and failed. Ethan closed his eyes for half a heartbeat, then muttered under his breath, "Yeah, not today," and stepped off the main path. The wind hit him harder out there, immediate and punishing, his thermal lining protesting as the temperature drop registered on his wrist display, warning indicators flickering amber, but he ignored them, focusing instead on the figure as he approached, boots sinking deeper into packed ice, each step deliberate, steady, until he was close enough to kneel, close enough to see her face, pale blue skin dulled by frost, faint patterns along her cheek barely visible beneath the ice crystals, her lips parted just enough to release a thin, uneven breath that almost disappeared before it formed. She wasn't moving much, not enough to survive out here, not enough to last another minute, and yet her eyes opened, slow, unfocused at first, then sharpening just enough to find him, not with hope, not with fear, but with something quieter, something resigned, as if she had already counted him among the ones who would keep walking. Ethan held her gaze for a moment, long enough to understand that look, then shook his head slightly and reached forward, his gloved hand brushing snow from her shoulder as he spoke, voice low but firm. "Yeah, you picked the wrong species to test that theory on." The cold bit deeper the moment Ethan shifted her weight into his arms, the wind clawing at the exposed edges of his jacket as if trying to pull her back into the snow, but he tightened his grip instead, one arm braced under her shoulders, the other supporting her legs, and stood with a slow, steady motion that kept her from slipping, her body lighter than he expected, not fragile, but drained, like something that had already spent too much energy simply existing in a place that did not want it. His wrist display pulsed again, temperature dropping, core heat warning creeping toward red, but he silenced it with a quick tap and turned toward the dim outline of the station entrance, calculating distance, wind resistance, and how long his thermal reserves would last if he kept moving at a controlled pace, because rushing would only waste heat, and losing heat meant losing both of them. Behind him, footsteps passed again, slower this time. Someone pausing just long enough to glance over, their expression unreadable beneath a visor, then continuing on without a word, and Ethan did not look back, not because he was angry, but because he understood, and that understanding made the silence heavier than any accusation. The alien in his arms shifted slightly, a faint movement against his chest, her breath uneven, brushing through the fabric of his jacket, and for a second he thought she might lose consciousness again, but her eyes opened instead, not fully, just enough to track the motion of the storm around them, and then settle on him, confusion flickering across her features as if she was trying to reconcile what was happening with what she expected to happen. "Do not." Her voice came out thin, barely audible over the wind, the words catching as if they were not used often. "You should not interfere." Ethan adjusted his hold without slowing, angling his body to shield her from the worst of the wind as they crossed the final stretch of open platform, boots slipping once before he corrected, muscles tightening under the strain. "Yeah," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I hear that a lot." The entrance doors loomed ahead, half frozen, their sensors struggling against the storm, and he reached them just as a gust slammed into his back, forcing him to lean forward, shoulder braced as he triggered the manual override panel with his elbow, the mechanism whining in protest before the doors slid open, just enough to let them through, sealing behind them with a heavy thud that cut the wind off instantly. The sudden quiet rang in his ears, broken only by the low hum of failing heaters and distant machinery, and he exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction as warmer air brushed against his face. Though it was still far from comfortable, the station interior barely holding above freezing. He carried her down the narrow corridor without stopping, past flickering lights and closed vendor stalls, until he reached a maintenance hatch tucked behind a stack of supply crates, one he had bypassed earlier without a second thought, but now it felt like the only place left that might hold enough heat to stabilize her. He keyed in a manual access code, the panel responding after a brief hesitation, and the hatch slid open to reveal a small service room lined with insulated panels and a dormant heater unit mounted against the far wall. Ethan stepped inside and sealed the hatch behind him, the space immediately quieter, smaller, the kind of place built for function, not comfort, but it would do. He lowered her carefully onto a folded thermal mat he pulled from a storage bin. Movements precise, controlled, making sure her head was supported, her body angled to retain what little heat she had left, and only then did he pull back slightly, studying her condition with a practiced eye, noting the shallow rise and fall of her chest, the faint tremor in her fingers, the way the color of her skin shifted subtly under the dim light. She watched him through half-lidded eyes, that same quiet confusion still there, but now mixed with something else, something that did not quite fit with the situation, as if she was waiting for a different outcome, one that had not come. "You are wasting resources," she murmured, her voice steadier this time, though still weak. "On a stranger." Ethan reached for the heater unit, pulling the manual ignition lever until it sputtered to life, a low orange glow filling the small room as warmth began to spread, slow but steady. "Yeah," he replied, settling back on his heels as he monitored the heat output. Would not be the first time. And for a moment neither of them said anything else, the silence stretching between them, not empty, but filled with the quiet sound of something changing, something neither of them had planned for, but neither of them stopped. The heater struggled at first, coughing out uneven bursts of warmth that flickered across the metal walls, but Ethan stayed with it, adjusting the intake valve with slow, practiced turns until the flame steadied into a low, consistent glow, the kind that did not promise comfort, but at least held back the cold, and that was enough for now. He pulled another thermal layer from the storage bin and draped it carefully over her, tucking it along her sides to trap heat without restricting her breathing, movements precise and efficient, the way someone works when there is no room for panic, only sequence and timing. Her eyes followed him the entire time, not wide with fear, not narrowed with suspicion, just watching, studying, as if every motion he made was being measured against something she already believed about him. And every second he did not match that expectation added to the confusion settling behind her gaze. "You calculate loss," she said after a moment, her voice gaining a little strength as the warmth began to take effect, still quiet, but clearer now. "Energy, time, risk, your kind is efficient." Ethan glanced at her briefly, then back to the heater, checking the output level again before responding. "Most days," he said, his tone even, "but not all of them need to make sense." She shifted slightly under the thermal cover, a small wince passing across her features before she stilled again, conserving what strength she had, and the movement revealed faint markings along her neck and collarbone, subtle patterns that seemed to catch the light differently, not quite reflective, but not entirely matte either, something engineered or inherited. He could not tell, and he did not ask. "Others did not stop," she continued, her eyes drifting toward the sealed hatch as if she could still see through it. Back to the platform, back to the endless line of figures who had passed her by. They saw, they assessed, then they moved on. Ethan leaned back against the wall, pulling his gloves off one at a time and flexing his fingers to bring feeling back into them. The skin pale from the cold, but steady. Yeah, he said, not defensive, not dismissive, just acknowledging it. That is how it works out there. Her gaze returned to him, sharper now, more focused. Then why did you not? The question hung in the air between them, simple on the surface, but weighted with something deeper, something that was not just curiosity, but expectation, like she already had an answer in mind and was waiting to see if he would confirm it. Ethan exhaled slowly, considering for a moment, not because he did not have an answer, but because the truth was not complicated enough to sound convincing. Because you were there, he said finally, shrugging one shoulder as if it were obvious. And because I could do something about it. She studied him in silence after that, her expression unreadable, but the tension in her features shifting, not softening exactly, but changing direction, like a calculation being rewritten in real time. That is not sufficient reasoning, she said, though there was less certainty in it now, less of the cold logic that had been there before. You gain nothing. Ethan allowed a faint, tired smile to cross his face as he reached for a small canteen and set it within her reach. You are still thinking like this is a transaction, he said, his voice calm, steady. Not everything is. The heater hummed quietly between them, filling the small room with a fragile pocket of warmth as the storm continued somewhere beyond the walls, distant now but still present. A reminder of how thin the barrier was between survival and surrender. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence settling into something almost balanced, until a faint sound broke through the background noise, a distant mechanical tone echoing down the corridor outside, followed by a voice over the station system, filtered and neutral. Attention all personnel, unidentified individual flagged on thermal scans. Assistance is not advised. Maintain distance and report any sightings immediately. The words lingered in the air, cold in a different way, and Ethan did not move at first, but his eyes shifted toward the hatch, then back to her. And for the first time since he had found her in the snow, the situation began to change in ways neither of them could ignore. The announcement faded into the low hum of the heater, but its presence lingered like a pressure in the room, subtle and unavoidable, and Ethan did not need to hear it twice to understand what it meant, because warnings like that were never issued for something harmless, and they were never issued without someone already tracking the signal. He stayed still for a moment longer, listening, not just to the corridor beyond the hatch, but to the rhythm of the station itself, the distant vibrations of machinery, the occasional shift in airflow, anything that might hint at movement heading their way. But the silence remained intact, thin and fragile, and that was almost worse than noise. Across from him, Lyra had gone very still, her earlier confusion replaced by something sharper, more controlled, as if the announcement had confirmed something she already suspected. And when she spoke again, her voice carried more clarity than before, steadier, though still quiet. You hear it, she said, not as a question, but as a statement. Ethan nodded once, his eyes still angled toward the hatch. Hard not to, he replied, then finally looked back at her, studying the shift in her posture. The way her fingers had curled slightly under the thermal layer, not from weakness this time, but from restraint. You want to tell me what they are really looking for? There was a pause, brief but deliberate, as if she was weighing the value of the answer against the risk of giving it, and for a second it seemed like she might deflect again, retreat behind the same cold logic she had used before. But instead she exhaled slowly, her gaze lowering just enough to break the direct line between them. They are looking for something that does not fit their order, she said, choosing each word carefully. Something that disrupts control. Ethan leaned back slightly, arms resting on his knees, the posture relaxed on the surface, but his attention fully engaged. That is a pretty wide category, he said, not pressing, just giving her room to continue. Her eyes lifted again, meeting his with a steadiness that had not been there before. Not here, she replied. Here. It is very specific. The heater crackled softly, the warmth growing more consistent now, and the subtle color returning to her skin made the faint patterns along her neck more visible. Intricate lines that seemed almost too precise to be natural, and Ethan noticed the way they pulsed faintly with her. Breathing, not bright, not obvious, but present enough to matter. You are not just a random traveler, he said quietly, not accusing, just stating what had become clear, and she did not deny it. Her silence serving as confirmation more than any words could. Another distant tone echoed through the corridor, softer this time, followed by the faint mechanical glide of something moving past, not stopping, but not far either, and Ethan shifted his weight slightly, his instincts adjusting to the new variable, calculating timing, distance, and options without letting it show in his expression. "If they are scanning for you," he said, his voice low but even, "then staying here is not going to hold for long." Lyra's gaze flicked toward the hatch, then back to him, and for the first time there was something like urgency beneath her composure, not panic, but recognition. "You should leave," she said, the words coming faster now, though still controlled. "You have already altered the outcome more than expected. Remaining will only increase your exposure." Ethan let out a quiet breath, a sound that might have been a laugh if there had been any humor in it. "You keep talking like this is some kind of experiment," he said, tilting his head slightly, "and I am starting to think you are not wrong." Her expression tightened at that, not in anger, but in something closer to realization, as if he had stepped closer to a truth she had not intended to reveal yet. The heater hummed steadily, the small room holding its fragile pocket of warmth against the cold pressing in from every side. And Ethan reached over to adjust the thermal cover around her shoulders, the motion simple, practical, and completely at odds with the situation unfolding around them. "I am not leaving," he added, almost as an afterthought, his tone calm, settled, as if the decision had been made long before the announcement ever played, and Lyra watched him in silence, the certainty in his voice clashing with every expectation she had carried into this moment, until finally she spoke again, softer this time. "That is not a logical choice." Ethan gave a small shrug, his attention already shifting toward the next step, whatever it needed to be. "Yeah," he said, "I figured that out a while ago." Ethan moved before the next announcement could finish cycling, not in a rush, but with a quiet efficiency that came from knowing time mattered even when it did not feel urgent yet, his eyes scanning the small service room for anything useful while his mind mapped the layout of the station beyond the walls. Routes he had walked before without thinking, now lining up in a sequence of options, some leading to open exposure, others to tighter corridors with fewer thermal sensors, and only a few that might buy them enough time to stay ahead of whatever was tracking her. He reached for a compact utility kit mounted near the heater unit, flipping it open with practiced hands, checking for portable heat cells, signal dampeners, anything that could interfere with a scan long enough to move unnoticed. But the contents were minimal, standard issue, nothing designed for this kind of situation, and he let out a slow breath before pulling a small thermal patch free and activating it, the surface warming instantly as he slid it beneath the outer layer wrapped around her shoulders. Lyra watched every motion, her earlier detachment replaced by a sharper awareness, her gaze following his hands, the tools, the door, the space between them, as if she was recalibrating everything she thought she understood about him. And when she spoke again, there was less distance in her tone, less of that clinical separation. "You are preparing to move," she said, her voice steady despite the strain. Ethan nodded once, already checking the seal on the hatch. "Staying still gets us found," he replied, simple, direct. "Moving gives us a chance." She studied him for a moment longer, then shifted carefully, testing her strength. The movement controlled but clearly difficult, and he noticed it immediately, stepping closer without hesitation, one hand ready to steady her if needed, but not forcing the help, giving her the space to decide. "I can walk," she said quietly, though the slight tremor in her voice suggested it would not be easy. Ethan did not argue, did not question it. He simply nodded again. "Then we move. Slow," he said, "and we pick the right path." Another distant mechanical glide echoed through the corridor, closer this time, followed by a faint pulse against the wall, almost like a sweep, and Ethan's expression tightened just a fraction as he recognized the pattern. "They are narrowing the scan," he added, more to himself than to her, then reached for the small control panel beside the hatch and dimmed the interior lighting to its lowest setting, letting the heater's glow provide just enough visibility without drawing attention. Lyra pushed herself upright with measured effort, her movements deliberate, conserving energy. And when she finally sat fully upright, the shift in her posture revealed more of those faint patterns along her skin, the lines now pulsing slightly stronger in the warmth, as if responding to the environment. And Ethan caught it again, that sense that what she was, or what she carried, was far beyond anything the station was equipped to handle. "You still do not understand the risk," she said, her eyes meeting his as she steadied her breathing. If they confirm my presence, they will not simply observe. Ethan held her gaze for a second, then gave a small, almost dismissive shrug. Not careless, but grounded. Yeah, he said, but right now they are still looking, which means they do not have you yet. He reached for the hatch control and paused, his hand hovering for just a moment as he listened again, measuring the silence, the distance, the rhythm of movement outside, then triggered the release, the mechanism unlocking with a soft click. The corridor beyond was dim, colder than the room, the air carrying that same low mechanical hum. But now it was empty, at least in sight, and Ethan stepped back just enough to give her space, his voice dropping slightly as he spoke. Stay close. Keep your movements controlled, and if I stop, you stop. Lyra nodded once, the motion small but certain, and as she rose to her feet, unsteady for a fraction of a second before finding her balance, there was a shift in her expression, not trust, not yet, but something moving in that direction, something unfamiliar but not unwelcome, and when she stepped toward the open hatch, she did not hesitate, because for the first time since she had been left in the snow, she was no longer waiting for someone to walk away. She was following someone who had already chosen not to. The corridor air felt thinner than before, not in pressure but in presence, like something had already passed through and taken notice, and Ethan moved with a controlled pace that matched the rhythm of the station rather than fighting it. Each step placed with intent, each pause calculated to blend rather than stand out, while Lyra stayed just behind his shoulder, close enough to follow his lead, but far enough to keep her balance, her movements careful, measured, every motion conserving energy. As the warmth from the service room began to fade from her system, the lighting overhead flickered in uneven intervals, casting long shadows across the narrow passage, and Ethan used them instinctively, timing their movement between pulses of light so that they appeared and disappeared with the station's own inconsistencies, a trick learned not from training manuals, but from years of working in places where being noticed meant being questioned, and being questioned meant losing control of the situation. Another soft tone echoed in the distance, followed by a faint sweep along the far wall, and Ethan slowed, lifting a hand slightly without turning, a silent signal for her to stop, and she obeyed immediately, freezing in place with a discipline that did not come from fear, but from experience, her breathing steady despite the strain, her eyes tracking the faint shimmer of the scanning field as it passed across the corridor ahead before dissipating into the metal structure. They are increasing frequency, she whispered, her voice barely more than air, and Ethan nodded once, eyes still forward. Yeah, which means we are closer than I would like, he replied, then shifted direction without hesitation, guiding them into a side passage that branched off toward the lower maintenance levels, the path narrower, less traveled, but also less monitored by standard traffic systems. The temperature dropped noticeably as they descended, the warmth from the upper levels replaced by a colder, more stable chill, the kind that settled into the walls and stayed there, and Lyra's steps faltered for a fraction of a second as her body reacted to the change, but she corrected quickly, her focus returning to him, to the pace he set, to the unspoken understanding that stopping now would undo everything they had managed so far. You adapt quickly, she said after a moment, not questioning, but observing, and Ethan let out a quiet breath that might have been a small laugh if the situation allowed it. You do not last long out here if you do not, he said, glancing back just enough to make sure she was still steady, still with him, then continued forward, his attention already shifting to the next turn, the next blind corner, the next potential point of exposure. The station groaned softly around them, metal contracting under the cold, distant machinery cycling through its endless routines, and for a brief moment the world outside the storm, outside the chase, felt almost normal, almost quiet, and it was in that moment that Lyra spoke again, her voice carrying something different now, something less guarded. You continue without certainty, she said, her eyes fixed on his back. No guarantee of outcome, no defined gain, and yet you proceed. Ethan slowed slightly, not stopping, just enough to consider the words, then answered without turning. Certainty is not always an option, he said. Sometimes you just pick a direction and make it count. She absorbed that in silence, the concept unfamiliar but not dismissed, turning it over the way she had been turning everything about him since he had stepped off the main path and into the snow. Another scan pulse rippled faintly through the structure, closer now, more precise, and Ethan felt it this time. A subtle shift in the air, like pressure building before a storm, and he adjusted again, guiding them toward a maintenance junction where multiple narrow corridors intersected, a place where signals could scatter, where tracking became less reliable. And as they stepped into that intersection, the overhead lights dimmed further, the space narrowing into shadow, and for the first time since they had left the service room, Ethan stopped completely, turning just enough to meet her gaze, his voice low but steady. "From here on, we do not get second chances," he said, and Lyra held his eyes for a second longer than before, the distance between them smaller now, not just in space, but in understanding, before she gave a single, deliberate nod. Because whatever this had started as, it was no longer just survival. It was something both of them had chosen, even if only one of them understood why. Ethan chose the left corridor without hesitation, not because it was safer, but because it felt less predictable. And in a place where patterns were tracked, unpredictability was the closest thing to cover, his boots landing softer now against the worn metal floor as he adjusted his pace to something quieter, slower. Each step measured against the faint hum of the station so that their movement blended into the background instead of cutting through it, while Lyra followed with a steadiness that had improved despite the cold still clinging to her frame. Her earlier weakness replaced by a focused control that spoke of discipline rather than recovery, as if whatever strength she had regained was being directed with intent rather than simply returning on its own. The corridor narrowed further, pipes lining the ceiling in uneven rows, condensation frozen along their edges, and the air carried a different sound here, a lower frequency vibration that masked smaller noises, and Ethan used it, guiding them along the inner wall where the shadows held longer, where the flickering lights did not quite reach, and where a thermal scan would have more difficulty separating their signatures from the surrounding infrastructure. Another sweep passed behind them this time, close enough that Ethan felt the subtle shift in temperature along his back, and he slowed just enough to let it move past without catching the full outline of their heat, his hand lifting again in that same silent signal, and Lyra responded instantly, her body stilling as if she had done this before, not in this place, but in others, in situations where being seen meant something far worse than being lost. "You are adapting your movement to the environment," she whispered after the sweep faded, her voice carrying a quiet recognition, and Ethan gave a slight nod without looking back. "Environment always wins if you fight it," he said, "better to let it hide you." They reached a junction where the corridor split again, one path leading upward toward the main systems, brighter, more exposed, the other descending into a darker section marked by outdated signage and minimal power draw. And Ethan paused just long enough to listen, not just for movement, but for absence, the kind of silence that meant no one bothered to monitor a place anymore. He chose the lower path, stepping into the dimmer passage where the lights barely held, and the temperature dropped another few degrees, the cold settling deeper into the metal beneath their feet. But the air felt stiller here, less disturbed, and that was what he needed. Lyra's steps slowed slightly as they descended, not from hesitation, but from thought, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted once more, less analytical, more searching. "You continue to assume responsibility," she said, her eyes fixed on him as they moved, "even after confirmation that I am the target." Ethan let out a quiet breath, the sound barely audible over the low hum around them. "I stopped assuming anything the moment I picked you up," he replied, his voice calm, grounded. "Now I am just dealing with what is in front of me." She absorbed that, the words settling differently than before, not dismissed, not fully understood, but no longer resisted. A faint vibration echoed through the corridor ahead, not a scan this time, but something heavier, more deliberate, and Ethan slowed again, his attention sharpening as he approached a narrow bend where the passage curved out of sight, his instincts tightening, not in fear, but in readiness, the kind that came before a decision point. He glanced back at her for a brief moment, long enough to confirm she was still steady, still focused, then turned forward again, his voice low, steady. "Stay right behind me," he said. And this time there was no hesitation in her response, no questioning of his choice, just a quiet, immediate compliance that spoke louder than any agreement. As they rounded the bend, the corridor opened slightly into a small maintenance chamber, empty at first glance, but the air felt different, charged in a way that did not match the rest of the station, and Ethan felt it before he saw it, a subtle tension, like the space itself was waiting, and for the first time since they had started moving, He stopped not because of a scan, not because of sound, but because something about this place did not want them to pass unnoticed, and Lyra, standing just behind him, felt it too. Her breath catching for the briefest second as the faint patterns along her skin pulsed once, brighter than before, as if responding to something unseen, something that had just begun to notice them in return. The moment stretched just long enough to feel intentional, as if the chamber itself had paused to acknowledge their presence, and Ethan did not step forward right away, his body holding still while his mind moved ahead, tracing possibilities, exits, angles, anything that explained the subtle shift in the air, because this was not just a gap in monitoring. It was something else, something designed or left behind. And he had learned the difference the hard way. Lyra stood close behind him, her breathing controlled but no longer entirely steady, the faint glow along the patterns on her skin rising and falling with a rhythm that did not match her pulse, more like a response than a reaction. And when she spoke, her voice carried a weight it had not before, quieter, but deeper. "This place, it is not inactive," she said, her eyes scanning the dim structure around them, and Ethan nodded once, already seeing it now that he was looking for it. The way the walls curved just slightly too smooth. The way the floor panels aligned with a precision that did not match the rest of the station, subtle differences that most people would never notice, but once seen, could not be ignored. He took a slow step forward, testing the space, and nothing reacted immediately. No alarms, no visible scans, just that same quiet tension pressing against the edges of perception, and he exhaled slowly. "Then we do not treat it like it is empty," he said, his voice low, steady, and continued into the chamber with careful, deliberate steps. The room opened wider than expected, a circular layout with a central platform slightly raised above the surrounding floor, its surface dark, almost matte, absorbing the limited light instead of reflecting it. And along the edges, faint seams suggested hidden panels or systems embedded beneath, dormant but not dead. Lyra's steps slowed as they moved closer, her attention drawn to the platform in a way that felt instinctive rather than curious, and Ethan noticed it immediately. The way her posture shifted, the way her focus narrowed. "You recognize this," he said, not asking, just stating what was clear, and she did not deny it this time. Her gaze fixed on the center of the platform as she spoke. "It is a relay," she said softly, "not for communication, for verification." Ethan frowned slightly, his eyes scanning the structure again, recalibrating what that meant. "Verification of what?" he asked, and for a moment she did not answer, as if the weight of the truth was something she had been holding back, not out of deception, but out of uncertainty about what it would change. Another faint pulse moved through the room, not like the scans from before, but something deeper, slower, and the patterns along her skin responded instantly, glowing just a fraction brighter. And that was when she looked at him again, her expression no longer guarded, no longer distant, but clear, almost resolved. "Of those who choose," she said, her voice steady now. "Those who act without directive, without gain. Those who deviate from expected behavior." Ethan let out a quiet breath, the meaning settling in as he glanced back at the platform, then at her. "You mean people like me?" he said, and she held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, a small, deliberate motion that carried more certainty than anything she had said before. The room hummed softly, the air shifting again, and this time it was not subtle, a low resonance building beneath the surface, and Ethan felt it through the soles of his boots, a vibration that suggested something was waking up, not aggressively, but with purpose, and he stepped slightly in front of her without thinking, not as a shield, but as a position, placing himself between her and whatever came next. "You said they are looking for you," he said, his voice calm despite the rising tension. "But this was waiting for something else." Lyra's eyes did not leave him as she answered. "It was waiting for confirmation," she said, and the faint glow along her skin pulsed once more, stronger now, reflecting softly against the dark surface of the platform. "That you would stop." The words settled into the space between them, quiet but undeniable, and for the first time since the storm, since the platform, since the moment he chose not to walk away, Ethan understood that this was never just about survival. It was about the choice itself, and the fact that he had made it when no one else did. And as the chamber responded to that choice, not with force, not with threat, but with recognition, the world around them shifted from pursuit to something far more unexpected, something neither of them could ignore anymore. The vibrations settled into a steady pulse beneath their feet, no longer building, no longer uncertain, just present, like a quiet acknowledgement that had already reached its conclusion, and Ethan did not move away from the platform, did not step back or try to interrupt whatever process had been set in motion, because nothing about it felt hostile, nothing about it felt like the scans that had chased them through the corridors. This was different, controlled, deliberate, and for the first time, since he had stepped into the storm, there was no pressure to act, only to stand and let the moment unfold. The dim light in the chamber shifted subtly, not brighter, but clearer, as if the space itself was adjusting to their presence, and the dark surface of the platform began to reflect faint outlines, not of the room, but of them, silhouettes softened by the low glow that pulsed in rhythm with Lyra's markings. And she stepped forward slightly, not past Ethan, but beside him, her posture no longer guarded, no longer defensive, just present. "It is complete," she said quietly, her voice steady, carrying none of the earlier tension, and Ethan glanced at her, then back at the platform. "That is it?" he asked, a hint of disbelief in the simplicity of it, and she gave a small nod. "That is all it was ever meant to be," she replied, her eyes shifting toward him again. And there was something different in her expression now, something that had not been there before, not curiosity, not calculation, but recognition. A faint tone echoed through the chamber, softer than the alerts from before, almost respectful, and then the distant hum of the station changed, the background systems adjusting in a way that was subtle, but noticeable, like a shift in priority, and Ethan felt it more than heard it. The difference between being tracked and being cleared. "They are not scanning anymore," he said, more observation than question, and Lyra nodded again, her gaze steady on him. "Because there is no longer anything to find," she said, then paused, just long enough for the meaning to settle before continuing. "The search was never for me alone." Ethan frowned slightly, his attention sharpening as the pieces began to align. "It was for someone who would stop," he said, repeating the conclusion he had already reached, and she did not correct him this time, did not add distance or qualification. She simply confirmed it with a quiet, "Yes." And the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any explanation. The chamber fell into a deeper silence after that, the kind that was not empty, but full of something unspoken, and Ethan let out a slow breath. The tension he had been holding easing without him realizing it had been there, his shoulders relaxing just enough to notice. And for a moment neither of them moved. Neither of them needed to. "So what happens now?" he asked finally, his voice calm, grounded, and Lyra turned her gaze toward the far side of the chamber, where a previously seamless section of the wall had shifted, revealing a narrow exit passage that had not been there before, its edges lit with the same faint glow that had traced her markings. "Now," she said, her tone quiet but certain, "we leave." And there was no urgency in it, no pressure, just a direction, clear and simple. Ethan followed her line of sight, then looked back at her, studying the change in her posture, the absence of strain in her movement, as she took a step forward without hesitation, and something in him recognized that the balance had shifted, not in control, but in understanding, and he fell into step beside her without a word. As they moved toward the newly revealed passage, the chamber behind them dimmed again, the platform returning to its quiet, inactive state as if nothing had ever happened, and the station beyond remained still, no alarms, no scans, just the distant hum of systems returning to their normal patterns. Lyra paused at the threshold of the passage, just for a second, and turned her head slightly toward him, her eyes meeting his with a clarity that needed no translation. "You did not act for reward," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "You acted because you chose to." Ethan gave a small shrug. The motion simple, almost dismissive, but not indifferent, seemed like the right thing. He replied, and she held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. A gesture that carried something deeper than agreement, something closer to respect. They stepped into the passage together, the light guiding them forward into a corridor untouched by the storm, untouched by the crowd that had walked past without seeing. And as the chamber sealed quietly behind them, the last trace of the cold world outside faded, leaving only the steady rhythm of their footsteps and the quiet understanding that sometimes the smallest decision, the simple act of stopping, was enough to change everything without needing to say a word.